Welcome back to the second video of my mini-series about a mini-series, where today we will be looking at the symbolism and themes in Over the Garden Wall that allude to its connection to Jungian psychology. In the last video, I alluded to something deeper going on, even deeper than the connections to the tarot, something altogether even more mysterious. I left you all on the image of the beast as a shadow, or as a shadowing being, and rest assured, I'll reveal these connections in due time, that is, later in the video. As for the general layout of the video, first we'll do a brief rundown of what Jungian psychoanalysis is, and then we'll dive right into how the show embodies the ideas and concepts from psychoanalysis. But first, a brief digression. Bear with me. If I tell you a joke and you find it funny and laugh, do you choose to find it funny? If I show you a baby and you find it cute, do you choose to find it cute? If you answered no to these questions, that is, answered honestly, then why do you laugh? Why do you smile at a baby? Why do you cry when you're sad? What is the source of all these things? These emotions that we can't seem to know or see the source of. If we don't see a source for them within us, then we must look beyond us. Enter the collective unconscious, that part of our minds that we are not only unaware of, but is shared among many individuals in a society. First recognized by famed psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he could see that it is the source of many of our emotions, and can even contain and convey information. Another of his seminal ideas was that of the archetypes, perennial symbols of psychic forms that recur continually throughout different people, times, and places in history. These are analogous to the forms of the major arcana we talked about in the last episode, except with a 20th century spin. The Senex instead of the hermit, the ruler instead of the emperor, etc. In fact, Jung took inspiration from the tarot when developing the idea of the archetypes. He gave the source, and the reason why these themes and archetypes keep showing up, as the collective unconscious. There are, however, archetypes and themes that he identified that did not come from the tarot, the self and the individuation process being chief among them. The self is the person/subject's whole being, their unification of their conscious and subconscious mind, and individuation is the process by which they unify those two aspects of themselves. It is my belief that in the show, we follow Wirt along his path to individuation. We see him go from a shy, self-doubting, fearful kid to a brave, caring, and self-assured, slightly older kid, if only by a few minutes. Generally speaking, the path to individuation has the subject recognizing their persona, confronting their shadow and uniting with their anima, and thus discovering their true self. There are many more steps and details to this process, but that is the general overview. Before we dive in, consider the metaphor of water that we see recurring in the show. In psychoanalysis, water and going or being underwater is commonly associated with the unconscious, both the personal and collective. You might be familiar with the famous iceberg image, where the tip is the conscious mind, and the portion beneath the water is the unconscious. The water in this metaphor represents the collective unconscious, the water that our mind and the minds of others float and interact in. This, I believe, is one excellent explanation for the unknown, how Wirt views the collective unconscious. And only when he and Greg are under that water can they see the archetypes that inhabit the depths and go on the road to individuation. As we did last time, let's start with our main character, Wirt, or more specifically, Wirt's persona. The persona in Jungian psychology is sort of an extension of Freud's concept of the ego, with the key difference, or rather extension being that the persona is like a mask that is shown to the outside world and to oneself, even to the point where they may not even know they're wearing a mask. Some degree of this, putting on a mask, being false or fake, is needed to simply get around in everyday life, however, and indeed in early childhood this is how the persona develops. For what little good it does, though, it oftentimes causes more problems than it fixes. One can start to forget one's true self beneath the mask and even start to believe that the mask is who they really are. This is why the process of individuation is necessary, to remove the mask and finally reconnect and rediscover who one really is. As for Wirt's persona, we can see he fancies himself, the thinking type, maybe a little too much. Because as good as being well-spoken and thinking things through is, we can see in the show it rarely does him any favors and often leads to further trouble. As the audience can clearly tell, Wirt is hobbled by low self-esteem and self-doubt. He is given multiple signs by his crush but cannot see or act on them due to his second-guessing. This second-guessing goes so far that he goes to the party where Sarah is at misses his chance again, then follows them to the graveyard to recover the tape of poetry and clarinet that Greg slipped into her jacket. This rendezvous is then broken up by a cop, and thus we have the impetus that causes his tumble beneath the waves into the unknown. But as for the specific character of his persona, we'll have to look to another archetype, namely the puer aeternus. Far from being the divine child, this archetype represents being stunted, or regression, physically, mentally, or spiritually. Puer is Latin for child, specifically male child. The alternative is puella aeterna, and aeternus is Latin for eternal. And thus we see those that embody this archetype as being childish in the worst ways, being stubborn for its own sake, not committing to anything too strongly, always leading a provisional life, afraid of the possibility of responsibility. In the earlier episodes, we see Wirt has all of these qualities in spades. He deliberately does the opposite of what Beatrice wants just to spite her. He can't commit to a plan to fight the possessed dog, and he can't even work up the courage to go up to the woodsman at first. In analytical psychology, this is a state that people often find themselves in at first, or rather often find themselves stuck in. There is a certain allure to being so completely free from responsibility, of being utterly carefree. But this goes hand in hand with not caring about anything. They are not willing to venture anything of value, and so will gain nothing of value. Now let's look at the counterpart to the puer aeternus, the senex, as he is played by the woodsman. The senex, or wise old man archetype, can be thought of as the opposite of the puer aeternus. While not childish to a fault and willing to accept responsibility, this archetype can tend to be stuck in their ways and resigned to fate, much like how we see the woodsman is in the show. As for his wisdom, when we first see the woodsman in the first chapter, he tells the boys right from the very start what the beast is. He is the death of hope. And even before that, as soon as the boys first talk to him, he tells them, "You're more lost than you realize." But you might be asking, if he is so wise, why doesn't he realize he's being played by the beast? Why does continue to give the lantern oil? Personally, I don't think that he was fooled per se. I think that owing to him being the embodiment of the senex archetype, that he's too resigned to his fate. He even says himself, "We all have our torch to burn." And while he may know he is being played, he doesn't want to risk his daughter's life either. And now for the other counterpart to the puer aeternus, the divine child, as played by Greg. In Jungian psychology, the divine child archetype represents potential, new beginnings, and is a major milestone in the process of individuation. It comes about near the end of the process, usually, and represents the true self about to be discovered. One key aspect to the divine child is that despite facing enormous, overwhelming odds, they find a way to survive, often with the help of others. Think Jesus versus Herod, Moses versus Pharaoh, Heracles versus Hera, etc. And likewise, in the show we see Greg, in spite of his small age and small stature, overcoming most obstacles with relative ease, all save for one. We see at the very end that he is being turned into an edelwood tree, and it is up to Wirt and the others to save him. This can be thought of as Wirt having to fight to save his true self from being consumed by his shadow, and in so doing he draws on the knowledge and wisdom that he has been given by the senex and from his anima. We now come to the anima, more specifically Wirt's anima as represented by Beatrice. In Jungian psychology, the anima is the feminine part of man, and the animus is the masculine part of women. Traditionally, in the journey of self-discovery, one must reconnect with or discover their anima or animus to find their true self, and thereby reach self-actualization. To me, Beatrice represents Wirt's anima. Not only is she a guiding feminine figure for both boys, especially Wirt, who has more one-on-one scenes with her, she also is on a journey of her own, and suffers from many of the same psychological inhibitions as Wirt does. We also see that to finally defeat the beast and leave the unknown, Wirt must save Beatrice, much like how Beatrice saved him, and her family by turning them human again. This is on top of working with Beatrice to overcome the beast, his shadow, at the very end. One more interesting thing to note. The anima resides almost exclusively in the unconscious, and very often in analytical psychology it is symbolized by water, or going underwater. And thus, only when Wirt and Greg are in the unknown, under the water, can they meet Beatrice. And now finally bringing it back around to the beginning, the beast and the shadow. In all the scenes where he is shown, he is always shrouded in shadow. This harkens back to the song in the 4th chapter I mentioned before. Not only is this to signify him being an evil or dark entity, but also to signify that his very essence is that of a shadow, namely, Wirt's shadow. The shadow can be thought of as the shadow cast by the persona, all those negative traits that come along with masking your true self, an inversion of the persona per se. And just like someone can come to identify with their persona, they can also start to identify with their shadow. Some would even say shadow possession. As for what traits Wirt shares with the beast, we can see that both are smart, or they like to think of themselves that way. Both don't like getting their hands dirty, and most importantly, both have a generally pessimistic/negative outlook. The beast embodies this throughout the show, but this can best be seen in Wirt in Chapter 8, where he laments how long him and Greg have been wandering, even to the point where he starts growing vines on him. But to me, this best typified by Wirt, when in Chapter 9 he sees Sarah pull out his tape in front of Jason Funderburker, and then turns to Greg saying, "That's it," and then hops down over the garden wall. He despairs what he sees so much. He is so despondent over the possibility of them listening to the tape that he willingly chooses to risk death in a certain sense and go into the unknown. Throughout the show, the beast mainly uses fear, manipulation, and intimidation to meet his goals, namely that of breaking the will of the unknown's inhabitants. And this leads me to my next point, the collective shadow. If individuals can have personal shadows in their unconscious, then it should stand to reason that a society could have a collective shadow in the collective unconscious. And it's possible that the beast could be the collective shadow as well. We see on numerous occasions that the boys are not the only target of the beast. In fact, we're told explicitly that most, if not all, the inhabitants of the unknown know the beast, so much so that the beast can sustain itself off of the hopelessness and resignation of the unknown's inhabitants by turning them into edelwood trees, then subsequently to oil. Finally, we come to the end of Wirt's journey of individuation, the self. The self, also sometimes referred to as the true self, can be thought of as the merging of the subject's conscious and unconscious contents. Some say that we are our true selves before we adopt a persona, that is, before we have to interact with society as small children. Personally, I think the self is a little bit more than this, because in becoming one's true self, the subject doesn't revert back to how they were as a baby, but rather incorporates everything that works from their persona, while also bringing to light those parts of themselves they lost in the past. All throughout the show, we see bits and pieces of Wirt's true self poking through, when he plays the bassoon, when agrees to help Lorna, and of course when he sets out to find Greg and defeat the beast. While these are all great character development, what should be noted about all of these is that they are all examples of Wirt's self-overcoming, that is, daring to go beyond his comfort zone and break his own limits. This is in stark contrast to how we see him in waking life, how he pines for Sarah and yet cannot bring himself to ask her out. Too afraid to fail, so he's too afraid to try. One could also view this as him being too content with the thought, the possibility of courting Sarah, too happy living in the world he's built for himself in his head. Only when he's forced to inhabit it and escape it that he comes to appreciate reality. We can see that during the final battle with the beast, Wirt internalizes all of the lessons and advice given to him throughout the series, and then has an epiphany right at the moment of his would-be defeat. This, to me, symbolizes Wirt overcoming and moving past his shadow, letting go of all those self-limiting beliefs that impeded him in waking life. Additionally, now when he is back in the land of the living, he has the confidence to ask out Sarah, if only to second-guess himself moments after. Don't worry, the narrator says everything turns out fine. And that does part 2. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, if this gets out by Christmas. Happy Hanukah, or any other holiday you celebrate during this time of year. As I said before, I am sincerely grateful for each and every one of you, and I hope you all will join me for the next video. Thanks again, and good night.